The West Coast has a new on-air legal analyst. CKNW presents the Boughton Law Legal Series, bringing you legal background information on the issues and stories that are top of mind. Investigate this week's hot topic at cknw.com/Boughton Law.
Yes, indeed, 7:39 on CKNW. We're kicking off our brand new series that Boughton Law is involved with here at CKNW. They're going to be joining us on the air to give us insights into legal solutions, whether it's in business or in life generally. They'll also join us to explain legal implications behind some of the biggest stories we cover throughout the year. And to kick things off, we're joined by Luca Cheaton, who is a business lawyer with Boughton Law, and we're going to talk for the next few minutes about what you need to think about when buying or selling a business. Luca, nice to have you in the studio. Good morning.
Good morning, you, John.
Tell me, let's start off with a simple question. What are the things that people need to keep in mind if they're buying or selling a business? Where do you start?
Well, part of the reason that we decided to do this in January was just because everyone's coming up with their resolutions for the year and what they want to get done, and these types of things can often months of planning and research, and so January is a good time to start looking at things that you might want to think about in terms of the types of business you might want to be looking at, the type of research you should be doing. And that brings us to the very first step, of course, which is research.
And what kind of research do you have to do? What things are you looking for? What red flags maybe you're looking for?
Well, initially in the beginning, it's going to be you as the client, as opposed to, say, the lawyer, that is researching the marketplace. Determine if the industry sector you're targeting is still viable, if the particular business you're looking at still has a good market share. And even as an individual, much like if you're buying a house or you're buying a car, you are going to do research.
Right.
And so you're going to be looking at, once you actually find a particular business, you're going to want to then look into how that business is operating.
And there are do you, at that point, have to set up a strategic plan? Should you start putting things down on paper in terms of what you expect from this business, or is that putting the cart before the horse?
No, I think it's good. I mean, it's always good to have priorities. And one of the things, again, you mentioned one of the red flags or pitfalls. And one of the things that clients often get carried away with and forget to do is, in the very beginning, prepare a list of priorities. Mm-hmm. Know what you need to get out of the transaction, out of the business. Know if you have limits, say, as to what you can spend or what kind of risk you're willing to take on, and then stick to it. Know that if you have to give up something, that you're not going to give up anything more than what you have listed in your priorities.
Now, is this, at this stage, would you go and actually look at an operation or meet the employees, that sort of thing, if there are any?
Well, once you've actually started researching the market and you found a business that seems viable, something that you like, then yes, this is where we start actually getting into the targeted research of the business, and where you might actually want to consider hiring professionals to help you with that, whether it be an accountant to help you review the financial statements, or even a lawyer to do various legal searches, WCB, CRA, really starting to get in-depth into the particular business.
Because going in, you want to have as much research, as much history, as much knowledge about what you're getting into as possible.
Well, yeah, because if you determine right up front that there's something wrong, there's really no need to pursue that particular business. You're not going to, again, if we think about a car, if the engine's not working, you're not going to buy the car. Yeah. So better to determine that up front.
Once you make a choice and you say, okay, this is a business, this is an operation that I really like, it's attractive, there are a couple of different ways to go in terms of what you're going to buy, whether you buy assets, whether you buy shares. Talk about that a bit.
Sure. Once we get to the stage that you've actually picked a business and you're targeting that, there's a number of basic terms that you as the purchaser can think about. And one of the most basic is, are you going to be buying the assets or the shares of the business? Now, a vendor always wants to sell the shares, and a purchaser always wants to buy the assets. And this is mainly for liability purposes. if you think about the business like a bag of groceries, say, you look through the bag, you might have some nice fruit on top, you might have a big juicy steak, maybe the milk towards the bottom is getting sour, the cheese might have some mold.
Yeah.
If I'm buying the assets, I can pick the things I like
Right.
and leave the rest. If I buy the shares, you buy the whole bag, good and bad. And, the allusion to the sour milk is obviously to liabilities. If you buy the shares, you inherit everything. Whereas we buy the assets, again, we can pick the good stuff and leave behind the bad.
And so how difficult is it to go through that process? Again, the common theme seems to be, or the thread seems to be research. You have to know what's going on before you can make a judgment on that bag of groceries.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'd like to say that, consult a professional early on, but that's not always something that's available to the client. Mm-hmm. And so some of the stuff can be done on their own. At this stage, they're more than likely, if they're really getting into the investigation of the business, they've probably already met the vendor, and they've probably signed some kind of confidentiality agreement so that they preserve the confidential nature of the information they're being provided. But discussions at this stage with the vendor can be very in-depth. And again, if it's available, I would suggest that at this point you are speaking to a professional about these things.
We will take a quick break and come back and continue with Luca Chiton. He is from Boughton Law, and they are CKNW's new legal partner for legal information, both about major stories that come up, and for segments like this to give you some ideas about certain aspects of life. And this morning we're talking about buying and selling business. When we come back, some of the hidden elements that people often forget when buying a business, some of the things that might trip you up. We'll get into those next here on CKNW. Our new legal series on CKNW with our on-air partner, Boughton Law. And we're talking with Luca Chiton. He is a business lawyer with Boughton Law. The discussion does not constitute legal advice, but to give you some broad strokes about what you need to think about and some of the things that you might not think about, the hidden elements of buying and selling a business. Now, I'm sure that more than one person has gone out and bought a business only to discover some of the skeletons in the closet or some of the past owners' practices or bills coming back to bite them. So what do you need to be aware of there?
Well, obviously, we're still talking about, continuing on for the previous segment, we're talking about the stage where you're at and you're still discussing with the vendor basic terms for the purchase and things that you might want to find out up front before we get too far down the line. Mm-hmm. One of the big ones that people often tend to forget about is related to the transfer of the employees. When you're buying a business, you're going to want to keep the employees that were initially affiliated with the business. And unless addressed otherwise in the contract or discussed up front, the purchaser ends up inheriting severance obligations tied to those employees, those severance obligations going back to the date of hire as opposed to the date of the transfer.
Right.
And, in fact, I had a transaction last year that fell apart because the purchaser found out that the upper management had a number of them had these golden parachutes that were going to need to be paid out within the next couple of years after the deal closed. And they were looking at millions of dollars in payouts in the first couple of years of operations.
Wow.
And knowing that, they decided, well, this is too much of an obligation to take on so early on in the operation, and the deal didn't go through. So knowing to discuss the status of the employees when just before we start really getting into the transfer is important.
And so you have to be aware of issues that could end up costing you a lot of money going forward, and stuff like that is a deal breaker.
It can be, definitely. It's really about what the purchaser is willing to deal with and take on. And, again, we talk about the metaphor of the car and wanting to know up front that the engine works, that the tires are purchased this past year. The same with the business. We're going to want to know as much as we can up front about the business, representations from the vendor that the state of the business is as clean as possible.
Mm-hmm. And when you get to the stage where you're drawing up documents, maybe a a letter of intent, a purchase agreement, that sort of thing. Is that just kind of paperwork that needs to be done, or are there things to be aware of and be concerned about there?
Well, it's a little self-serving for me to comment on this because this is what I do, and this is the meat of what they hire the lawyers for. It's the part that I think the lawyers contribute the most value at. It can be done very quickly depending on the type of business, but more often than not, this can be months of negotiations back and forth. And I'd like to say I can just pick a document off the shelf and send it over and it's ready to go, but that's not the case. Every business is different, so every piece of paperwork is a bit different and can take time to perfect.
So in an agreement, once you sit down and do the lawyer's work and put together a purchase agreement, what are some of the elements that are included in there?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is where we contribute our value, and I could spend hours here talking to you about the various sections and the various parts that we can...
Well, you've got 3.5 minutes.
3.5 minutes, okay. Most obviously, purchase price. Right. In the simplest type of transaction, you're writing a check for the purchase price, and that's it. Generally, though, that's not the case, and the purchase price is segmented. It can be segmented in a number of different ways. Perhaps you pay a portion up front. Another piece is considered paid over time, much like a loan to the vendor. It might gather interest. The vendor might take security for that payment. There might be a holdback on the purchase price in case, as we mentioned, any of the unforeseen liabilities come up to bite you after closing. You're going to want to have, as a purchaser, a portion of the purchase price held back to draw on to satisfy those liabilities. Beyond purchase price, again, we get into reps and warranties. Again, what we were talking about in the state of the car. We want to make sure that the business is in good standing and everything about it is as clean as possible. And this will be a big chunk of the agreement. You can often see 20 to 30 pages of reps and warranties because the purchaser wants to be sure that what they're getting is what they're paying for.
Exactly. And we touched on this with the hidden elements, but are there deals that are just, I don't know, too good to be true? I mean, are there deals where you just walk away from it because it just doesn't seem right, it doesn't feel right? I mean, is there any gut instinct in this?
Oh, for sure. And as a final segment, these are probably good things to take away. And that is one of the points that I think people should be aware of, is that if it doesn't pass a smell test, again, we talked about the notion of employees. Whether it's an issue with employees or an issue about the state of the business, buyers should know up front that at what point they need to walk away. And at a certain point, as much as they may be tied to the business, as much as they may like the way the shiny sports car looks, if the engine's not working, you need to walk away and go to the next car.
What happens when you buy a business, you take over, you're in charge, and suddenly there is a liability from the previous owner that pops up? Now, having talked about all of the research that... Yeah. But when something like that happens, let me ask it another way. Does it happen very often?
Well, it can happen, and it may be something small, and it may be something large. And this is where I hope you had a good lawyer helping you out. Because, as we said, if something turns out to be a liability after closing, ideally you have a holdback, like we were talking about, from which you can draw on to satisfy that liability. If say you don't have any money that you've held back from the purchase price, well, unfortunately, then you're in a position that you have to determine if you're going to sue the vendor or not. And
that opens up a whole other can of unnecessary worms.
Yeah,
hopefully unnecessary.
Yeah, and you have to decide whether it makes financial sense to do so.
I appreciate you coming in this morning.
Thank you very much, John.
Luca Chiton, he is a business lawyer with Boughton Law, and Boughton Law is CKNW's new on-air legal partner. And throughout this year, they're going to be joining us to give us the lowdown on legal solutions in business and in other aspects of life. They'll also be on the air to explain the legal implications behind some of the bigger stories that we cover throughout the year. I can direct you to cknw.com/Boughton Law if you would like more information. Head there and check out the CKNW website. That's cknw.com/Boughton Law. Heading for the major news to 8 o'clock on NW. After the major news to 8, we're going to talk about modern-day pirates who take over your computer using a program called Crypto Wall. Internet extortionists who demand a ransom to unlock your files. Our question for the day is, would you pay? Plus, we'll give you some hints to keep your info safe so you don't have to find yourself in that position. Modern-day internet pirates, extortionists demanding ransoms to give you your files back. That's coming up here on the John McComb Show on CKNW News Talk 980.
The West Coast has a new on-air legal analyst. CKNW presents the Boughton Law Legal Series, bringing you legal background information on the issues and stories that are top of mind. Investigate this week's hot topic at cknw.com/BoughtonLaw.